The crackling static over the radio should have been routine. Captain Sarah Chen had heard 1,000 distress calls during her 6 years flying Apache helicopters in combat zones, but something about this one made her blood run cold. It was 0347 hours on a moonless night in the Kunar Province of Afghanistan, and the voice on the other end wasn't just desperate, it was drowning in the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and screaming. Any Allied air support, this is Ranger 27 actual. We have 420 personnel pinned down in a valley, surrounded on 3 sides. Heavy casualties. We are being overrun. I repeat, we are being overrun. The transmission cut out, replaced by an explosion so loud it distorted through the speakers. Sarah's hands tightened on the cyclic stick of her AH-64D Apache Longbow as she exchanged glances with her co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, sitting in the front seat below her. They were supposed to be on a standard patrol mission, maintaining air superiority over a quiet sector 50 miles from where that distress call originated. But quiet sectors didn't matter when 420 American Rangers were about to be slaughtered. Did he just say 420 Rangers? Marcus's voice cracked slightly over the internal comms. Even for a seasoned combat pilot, that number was staggering. A force that size represented multiple companies, possibly even a battalion element. How had so many soldiers ended up trapped? Before Sarah could respond, their commanding officer's voice burst through their headsets from the forward operating base. Apache 79er, this is Wildcat Control. Disregard that transmission. You are not, I repeat, not authorized to deviate from your patrol route. We have fast movers being scrambled from Bagram. ETA 45 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 45 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd been in enough firefights to know that 45 minutes was an eternity when you were surrounded by enemy forces. Those Rangers would be lucky if half of them survived the next 10 minutes, let alone 3/4 of an hour. She pulled up the grid coordinates from the distress call on her display, her mind already calculating distances, fuel consumption, and ammunition loads. Wildcat Control, Apache 79er. Request clarification. 420 personnel is a significant force. What's their tactical situation? Sarah kept her voice steady, professional, even as every instinct screamed at her to break formation and head toward those coordinates. There was a long pause. Too long. When the response came, it was clipped and frustrated. Apache 79er, multiple Ranger companies were conducting a joint operation to clear a Taliban stronghold in the Crackling Valley. Intelligence was bad. Real bad. They walked into a prepared ambush with an estimated 800 to 1,000 enemy fighters. The valley's a kill box, and every exit is locked down. Now maintain your current patrol pattern. That's an order. The Crackling Valley. Sarah had heard stories about that cursed piece of terrain. The soldiers who operated there called it the Valley of Death. It was a maze of steep ravines, thick forests, and cave complexes that had been Taliban territory for generations. The enemy knew every rock, every trail, every firing position. Sending a large force in there was suicide unless you had perfect intelligence, and clearly, someone had screwed up catastrophically. Another transmission broke through, weaker this time, barely audible through the interference. Any Allied aircraft, this is Ranger 27, we've got wounded everywhere, mortar fire is destroying our position, for God's sake, we need air support now. Sarah made her decision in that instant. She joined the army to save lives, not to follow orders that condemned fellow soldiers to death. Her father, a Marine who'd served in Desert Storm, had once told her that there were times when doing the right thing meant disobeying orders, and this was one of those times. She'd face whatever consequences came later, but she wouldn't abandon those Rangers. Marcus, I'm breaking formation. Lock up your targeting systems and prepare for immediate combat engagement. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, as she banked the Apache hard to the left and pushed the throttles forward. Sarah, what are you? Wildcat Control just ordered us to. Marcus started to protest, but she cut him off. I know what they ordered, and I'm disobeying that order. 420 Rangers are dying right now, and we're the only air asset within range that can do anything about it. You can report me when we get back, but right now, I need you focused on keeping us alive and killing the enemy. Are you with me? There was only a moment's hesitation before Marcus responded, and she could hear the grim determination in his voice. Hell yes, I'm with you. Let's go save some lives. The Apache screamed through the night sky at nearly 180 miles per hour, its twin turbine engines roaring as Sarah pushed the helicopter to its maximum speed. Behind them, she could hear Wildcat Control frantically trying to recall them, threatening everything from court-martial to dishonorable discharge, but she'd already switched off that frequency. There would be time for consequences later. Right now, she had one mission: reach those Rangers before they were completely wiped out. The terrain below them transformed as they approached the Karengal Valley. The relatively flat desert gave way to increasingly hostile mountains that jutted up like jagged teeth trying to tear them from the sky. Sarah had to constantly adjust her altitude, threading the Apache through mountain passes while maintaining maximum speed. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and they'd slam into a mountainside at full throttle. I've got eyes on the valley. Jesus Christ, Sarah, it's worse than I thought, Marcus reported from the front seat, his night vision systems giving him a clear view of the carnage below. I'm seeing muzzle flashes everywhere. The Rangers are completely surrounded in a depression, maybe 200 meters in diameter. The enemy has the high ground on all sides. It's a shooting gallery. Sarah crested the final ridge and got her first look at the situation. Even through her night vision display, which turned the darkness into shades of green, the scene was apocalyptic. Tracers from machine guns created deadly spider webs of light crisscrossing the valley floor. Mortar rounds were systematically walking across the Rangers' position, each explosion blooming like a deadly flower. She could see the thermal signatures of dozens, no, hundreds, of enemy fighters positioned in the rocks and trees surrounding the trapped Americans. Apache inbound to Ranger 27 actual. This is Captain Sarah Chen. We're 2 minutes out with 30 Mike cannon, Hydra rockets, and Hellfire missiles. Give me targets, over. She transmitted on the emergency frequency, hoping someone down there was still alive to coordinate with them. The response came immediately, and she recognized the barely controlled panic in the voice. Apache, this is Major Harrison, Ranger 27 actual. Thank God you're here. We've got heavy machine gun positions on the North Ridge, coordinates November Papa 375A21. They're tearing us apart. We've already lost over 60 men, and our corpsmen are overwhelmed. We need immediate fire support on that position. Marcus, you heard the man. Target those coordinates. Ladies first on the trigger, Sarah said with dark humor as she brought the Apache into an attack run. The helicopter's sophisticated targeting systems locked onto the enemy position, painting it with infrared designators that were invisible to the naked eye but clear as day on their displays. Locked and firing, Marcus confirmed, and Sarah felt the slight shudder as the first AGM-114 Hellfire missile detached from their wing pylon and streaked downward on a column of fire. The missile's tandem warhead was designed to penetrate bunkers, but it worked just as well on machine gun nests dug into mountainsides. The explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun, and through her display, Sarah watched the thermal signatures of a dozen enemy fighters simply vanish, erased from existence in a millisecond. But there was no time to celebrate. They'd gotten the Taliban's attention now, and every fighter in the valley knew there was an American helicopter overhead. Tracers immediately began reaching up toward them from multiple positions, streams of bullets that looked deceptively slow but were actually traveling at supersonic speeds. Sarah threw the Apache into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, banking hard left, then right, then dropping altitude so fast her stomach lurched. The helicopter was tough, it could take hits from small arms fire and keep flying, but a lucky shot to the engine or transmission could bring them down just as easily as it could any other aircraft. Taking fire from multiple positions. I'm seeing RPG launches, brake right, brake right. Marcus shouted, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed the cyclic stick to the right and pulled up, feeling the G-forces press her into her seat as the Apache corkscrewed through the air. Behind them, 2 rocket-propelled grenades passed through the space they'd occupied a second before, their motors still burning as they spiraled off into the darkness. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding her system, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what she'd trained for through thousands of hours of flight time. This was why she'd endured the skepticism, the discrimination, the countless people who said women couldn't handle combat aviation. She'd proven them wrong in training, and now she'd prove them wrong when it really mattered. Marcus, switched to the 30 mic. I'm going to make a gun run on the eastern ridge. I saw at least 50 enemy fighters massing there, probably getting ready to overrun the Rangers' position. She lined up the Apache for another attack, this time bringing them in low and fast, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible second. The M230 chain gun mounted beneath the Apache's nose was a work of terrible beauty. It fired 30mm high-explosive rounds at a rate of 625 per minute, and Marcus had become a virtuoso at wielding it. As Sarah brought them screaming over the eastern ridge at an altitude of less than 100 feet, Marcus opened fire. The cannon made a distinctive buzzing roar, like an angry hornet amplified 1,000 times, and the rounds traced a line of destruction across the mountainside. Each 30mm round was designed to explode on impact, and the effect on human targets was devastating. Sarah watched enemy fighters torn apart, their thermal signatures flickering and dying as the explosive rounds found them. But for every enemy fighter they killed, it seemed like 2 more appeared. The Taliban had committed massive resources to this ambush, and they weren't about to let their prize escape just because one American helicopter had shown up. As Sarah pulled up from the gun run, her threat warning system began screaming at her, and she knew what that meant even before Marcus confirmed it. Manpads launch. We've got a surface-to-air missile inbound. Marcus's voice was tight with fear. A man-portable air defense system, essentially a shoulder-fired missile designed specifically to kill helicopters, had just been fired at them. The Taliban had brought serious hardware to this fight. Sarah's training took over, her hands moving in a blur. She punched the countermeasure release, sending a cascade of flares streaming from the Apache's dispensers. The burning magnesium flares were designed to confuse the missile's heat-seeking guidance system, drawing it away from the helicopter's engine exhaust. At the same time, she threw the Apache into a diving turn, trying to put a mountain ridge between them and the missile. For 3 eternal seconds, she didn't know if they'd live or die. The missile could easily ignore the flares and stay locked on them, in which case the 20-pound warhead would turn their helicopter into a fireball. But then she saw the missile veer off, chasing one of the flares, and detonate harmlessly 100 meters away. Clear. The missile missed. Marcus reported, but there was no relief in his voice because they both knew the next one might not miss. They were deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostiles, and their presence had stirred up a hornet's nest. Sarah checked their ammunition and fuel status, and her heart sank. They'd expended 2 Hellfire missiles and nearly a third of their 30mm ammunition in just the first few minutes of combat. At this rate, they'd be Winchester, out of ammunition, within 15 minutes. And their fuel was already below 60% thanks to the high-speed dash to reach the valley. They were operating on borrowed time. Ranger 27, Apache 79er. We've temporarily suppressed the enemy on your north and east flanks, but you've still got heavy contact to the south and west. What's your tactical situation? Sarah needed to know how bad things really were on the ground. Major Harrison's response was grim. Apache, we're in bad shape. We've got over 100 wounded now, and we're running critically low on ammunition. The enemy is probing our perimeter constantly, and we've had to fall back twice. They're trying to split our force in half and destroy us piecemeal. We need continuous air support and a casevac for our worst wounded, but I don't know how any medevac birds could land in this hellstorm. Sarah's mind raced through options. A standard medevac operation required securing a landing zone, which was impossible with the Rangers completely surrounded. The wounded would die without medical evacuation, but any helicopter that tried to land would be shot out of the sky. It was an impossible situation, and yet she couldn't accept that answer. Major, I need you to consolidate your casualties in your most defensible position. Move your able-bodied soldiers to create a security perimeter. When you're ready, pop purple smoke to mark your casualty collection point, Sarah ordered, an insane plan forming in her mind. Captain, with all due respect, there's no way a medevac bird can get in here. The enemy has too much firepower in the surrounding ridges, Harrison replied, confusion evident in his voice. I'm not talking about a medevac bird, Major. Give me 10 minutes to work the problem, Sarah responded, then switched to her internal comms with Marcus. How much gun ammo do we have left? About 800 rounds, plus we've got 18 Hydra rockets and 2 Hellfires remaining. Sarah, what are you thinking? Marcus asked, though she suspected he already knew. I'm thinking that an Apache can land and take on passengers if it absolutely has to. We're not configured for it, and it'll be a tight squeeze, but we could fit maybe 4 or 5 critically wounded in the crew compartment and on the stub wings if we ditched the remaining weapons, she said, knowing how crazy it sounded even as she said it. There was a long silence before Marcus responded. That's completely against protocol. The Apache isn't designed for medevac. We'd be overweight, undermaneuvered, and vulnerable. Plus, the moment we land, we become a stationary target. They'd have every gun in the valley shooting at us. I know. But those men are dying, Marcus. We're already facing court-martial for disobeying orders and coming out here. Might as well get court-martialed for something that actually saves lives, Sarah said, her voice hardening with determination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alright, I'm in. But we do this smart. We use our remaining ordnance to clear the landing zone as much as possible, and we keep the engines running the entire time we're on the ground. The second things go completely sideways, we abort and get out of there, Marcus agreed, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her co-pilot's willingness to follow her into this madness. Deal. Now let's clear a path to hell and back. Sarah pulled the Apache into a high orbit above the battlefield, gaining altitude to get a complete tactical picture of what they were facing. From 2,000 feet, the scope of the disaster became horrifically clear. The Rangers were compressed into an area roughly the size of 2 football fields, surrounded on all sides by enemy positions that formed concentric rings of death. The Taliban had clearly planned this ambush for weeks, maybe months, pre-positioning ammunition, weapons, and fighters in prepared positions throughout the valley. Marcus, I'm going to need you to be surgical with our remaining ordnance. We've got to create enough chaos and destruction that we can land, load wounded, and get out before they regroup. That means hitting their command and control, their heavy weapons positions, and anything that looks like a rally point, Sarah explained as she brought up the targeting overlay on her display. Roger that. I'm seeing what looks like a command post on the western ridge, multiple thermal signatures clustered around what might be communication equipment. That should be our first target, Marcus replied, his voice taking on the calm, analytical tone of a professional gunner selecting targets for destruction. Agreed. Lasing target now. Sarah designated the position with her laser targeting system, and within seconds, Marcus had a Hellfire missile locked on. Firing in 3, 2, 1, missile away. The Hellfire streaked downward, its rocket motor leaving a barely visible trail in the night sky. 7 seconds later, the warhead impacted directly in the center of the enemy command post. The explosion was massive, far larger than their previous strikes, and Sarah realized they'd probably hit an ammunition stockpile. Secondary explosions rippled across the ridgeline as stored rockets, mortar rounds, and grenades cooked off in a chain reaction of devastation. Good hit. I'm seeing chaos in the enemy positions. They're breaking formation on the western side, Marcus reported, watching enemy fighters scatter from their positions, their coordinated attack dissolving into confusion. But Sarah knew the respite would be temporary. The Taliban commanders would rally their forces within minutes, and they needed to maximize this window of opportunity. She brought the Apache down in a screaming dive, leveling out at less than 50 feet above the valley floor, so low that her rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris. Going hot with rockets. Danger close to friendly positions. I hope those Rangers have their heads down, Sarah warned as she lined up on a concentration of enemy fighters massing for what looked like a final assault on the Rangers' southern perimeter. She pickled off 6 Hydra rockets in rapid succession, the 2.75-inch unguided rockets whooshing from their launch pods with trails of white smoke. The rockets impacted across a 100-meter stretch of mountainside, each one detonating with a sharp crack and sending shrapnel scything through everything in a 20-meter radius. Through her thermal imaging, Sarah watched dozens of enemy thermal signatures flicker and disappear. Ranger 27, Apache 79er. We've disrupted enemy formations on your western and southern flanks. You should have a brief window to consolidate your casualties. Pop that purple smoke now, Sarah transmitted, pulling the Apache into another climb to gain altitude for their next attack run. Roger, Apache. Purple smoke deployed. Captain, I don't know what you're planning, but whatever it is, do it fast. We've got reports that enemy reinforcements are moving into the valley from the north. If they get here before our relief force, we're finished, Major Harrison responded, and Sarah could hear the weight of command in his voice, the terrible burden of knowing that hundreds of lives depended on decisions made in split seconds. Through her night vision system, Sarah watched as purple smoke began billowing from the center of the Rangers' defensive position. It looked impossibly small, impossibly vulnerable, a tiny island of American forces in a sea of hostiles. And she was about to try to land her $20 million attack helicopter right in the middle of that killing zone. Marcus, dump our remaining Hellfires on the northern approach. If reinforcements are coming from that direction, let's give them a warm welcome. Then we're going in, Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. Targets locked. Firing both Hellfires. Marcus launched their last 2 missiles, sending them racing toward concentrations of enemy forces on the northern ridgeline. The twin explosions lit up the mountainside, and Sarah hoped they'd bought enough time. She nosed the Apache over and began her descent toward the purple smoke. This was the most dangerous moment, transitioning from a fast-moving, maneuvering aircraft to a stationary target sitting on the ground. Every second they spent landed would be a second in which hundreds of enemy guns could draw a bead on them. All Rangers, Apache 79er is coming in hot. I need your best soldiers forming a security perimeter around that purple smoke. Anyone who's not critically wounded, get your weapon pointed outward and start suppressing enemy positions. We're going to be vulnerable as hell down there, and I need you to keep the bad guys' heads down, Sarah transmitted to the entire Ranger frequency as the ground rushed up to meet them. The landing zone was a nightmare, uneven terrain, rocks and debris scattered everywhere. Barely enough flat ground to set down the Apache's landing gear. But Sarah had landed in worse conditions during training, and she'd be damned if she couldn't do it when lives were on the line. She brought the helicopter into a hover, using the purple smoke to orient herself, then began her descent. Bullets immediately began pinging off the Apache's armored hull. The Rangers were returning fire, their rifles and machine guns creating a curtain of suppressive fire around the landing zone. But there were simply too many enemy positions for them to cover everything. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder as something heavier, probably a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, found its mark. Taking hits to the fuselage. No critical systems damage yet, but we need to make this fast. Marcus called out, his voice tight with tension. The Apache's skids touched ground with a jarring thump, and Sarah immediately began reducing power to the rotors while keeping the engines at flight idle. They had to be ready to lift off at a moment's notice. We're down. Load casualties now. The rear of the Apache wasn't designed to carry passengers. It was a flying weapons platform, built for speed and lethality, not for rescue operations. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and the Rangers didn't waste a second questioning the insanity of what was happening. Within seconds of touchdown, Sarah heard someone pounding on the side of the fuselage. She twisted in her seat to look back through the narrow crew compartment. 2 Rangers had already climbed onto the stub wings, the hardpoints normally reserved for missile and rocket pods, and were strapping themselves down with whatever they could find. Another soldier was being passed up, this one clearly unconscious, his uniform soaked with blood. A Ranger medic was trying to stabilize him while simultaneously securing him to the aircraft. Captain, we've got 5 critical casualties that won't survive the next hour without a surgeon. We need to get them out now. A sergeant, Sarah couldn't see his rank in the darkness and chaos, but his voice carried authority. shouted up at her through the open crew door. "How many can you get secured in the next 30 seconds?" Sarah shouted back, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding ridgelines. Muzzle flashes were increasing in frequency as the Taliban realized what was happening and redirected their fire toward the landed helicopter. 4, maybe 5 if we stack them. "But Captain, you're overweight as hell with this many people and full fuel. Can this bird even lift off?" The sergeant's question was legitimate. The Apache had strict weight limits, and they were about to exceed them significantly. "We're about to find out. Load them now." Sarah began increasing power to the rotors, feeling the helicopter strain against its own weight. Warning lights were already illuminating on her instrument panel, alerts about exceeding maximum takeoff weight and rotor stress. She ignored them all. Marcus was working his gun, the 30mm cannon barking out short, precise bursts at enemy positions that were getting too close. "Sarah, we've got dismounted infantry moving toward our position from the east. Range 200 meters and closing. We need to go, now." 30 seconds, Marcus. "They're loading the wounded." Sarah could see the Rangers working with desperate efficiency, lifting limp bodies and securing them anywhere they could find purchase on the helicopter. One soldier was literally being tied to the landing gear with parachute cord. This was beyond unconventional, it was borderline suicidal. An RPG whooshed past the Apache's nose, missing by less than 10 meters, and detonated against a rock outcropping behind them. The explosion sent shrapnel pinging off the helicopter's armored skin, and Sarah felt one of the Rangers on the stub wing flinch as something hit him. But he held on, refusing to let go even as blood began streaming down his arm. "We're loaded. Go, go, go." The sergeant slapped the side of the fuselage twice, the prearranged signal, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled collective, increasing the pitch of the rotor blades to generate maximum lift, while simultaneously feeding in forward cyclic to transition into forward flight. The Apache groaned in protest, its engines screaming as they fought against physics and gravity. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought they weren't going to make it. The helicopter was too heavy, the air too thin at this altitude, the power available insufficient for the weight they were carrying. The skids lifted a few inches off the ground, then settled back down with a thump. "Come on, baby. Come on." Sarah coaxed the helicopter, adjusting her control inputs, trying to find that perfect combination that would get them airborne. She could hear Marcus firing the gun again, buying them precious seconds as enemy fighters closed in on their position. Then, miraculously, the Apache clawed its way into the air. It was the ugliest, most ungainly takeoff Sarah had ever performed, more of a struggling leap than a proper lift-off, but they were flying. She kept the helicopter low, accelerating to translational lift, the speed at which forward flight becomes more efficient than hovering. Every foot of altitude, every knot of airspeed, was earned through sheer willpower and the Apache's straining engines. "We're up. Heading southwest, using terrain masking to break contact," Sarah reported, throwing the overloaded helicopter into a valley that would put a mountain between them and the bulk of the enemy forces. Behind them, she could hear someone screaming, one of the wounded, and the sound cut through her heart like a knife. "Ranger 27, Apache 79er. We've extracted 5 critical casualties and are heading for the forward operating base. Hold your position, fast movers should be inbound soon with the air support you need," Sarah transmitted, hoping it was true, hoping that help would arrive before the remaining Rangers were overrun. "Roger that, Apache. You just gave us hope. Keep those boys alive. Ranger 27 out." Major Harrison's voice was hoarse, strained, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this night. Sarah focused on flying, using every trick she'd learned to keep the crippled, overloaded Apache in the air. The helicopter was handling like a garbage truck, its responses sluggish and unpredictable. The slightest wrong move could send them into an unrecoverable spin, killing everyone aboard. Behind her, she could hear the Ranger medic working on the wounded, shouting instructions to the other soldiers who were trying to help. "How long to the FOB?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with worry. Sarah checked their navigation display and felt her heart sink. 18 minutes at our current speed. I don't dare go any faster, we're already redlining the engines. 18 minutes. It might as well have been 18 hours for men bleeding out in the back of a helicopter that was never designed to carry them. Sarah pushed the thought aside and focused on flying. They'd come this far. They weren't going to lose anyone now. The flight back to the forward operating base was the longest 18 minutes of Sarah's life. Every vibration, every unusual sound from the engines, every warning light that flickered on her instrument panel sent spikes of adrenaline through her system. The Apache was designed to take battle damage and keep flying, but they were pushing it far beyond its design specifications. The helicopter was carrying at least 1,000 pounds more than its maximum rated weight, and the engines were running hot, their temperature gauges creeping into the red zone. Behind her, the Ranger medic, she'd learned his name was Specialist Davis, was performing miracles in the cramped confines of the crew compartment. In the darkness, using only a red-filtered flashlight to preserve night vision, he was trying to keep 5 critically wounded men alive with limited medical supplies and even more limited space to work. "Captain, I've got a sucking chest wound here. I need to get this guy on a ventilator, but I can't do it while we're bouncing around like this. Can you smooth out the flight?" Davis shouted over the roar of the engines and rotors. Sarah was already flying as smoothly as she could, but the overweight helicopter and the turbulent mountain air made anything resembling a stable flight profile nearly impossible. "I'm doing the best I can, Specialist. Just keep him breathing for 10 more minutes. 10 minutes might be 9 minutes too long for this one. He's got a tension pneumothorax, his lung is collapsing." Davis responded, and Sarah could hear the desperation in his voice. He was watching a soldier die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Marcus twisted in his seat, trying to see into the crew compartment behind them. "What does he need? What can we do? I need to perform a needle decompression, but I can't do it blind. I need light." Davis was already moving, his hands working on the wounded soldier even in the darkness. Sarah made a split-second decision that broke yet another rule. "Marcus, turn on the cabin lights. I don't care if it ruins our night vision. That soldier needs light, he gets light." The interior of the Apache flooded with white light, temporarily blinding both pilots who'd been flying on night vision systems for hours. Sarah blinked away the spots in her vision and forced herself to focus on the instruments in front of her. She could readapt to night flying. The wounded soldier couldn't wait. In the harsh white light, Sarah caught a glimpse of the scene behind her through the narrow space between the seats, and it made her stomach turn. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, on the soldiers trying to help. The 5 wounded Rangers were in various states of consciousness, their uniforms torn and soaked with blood. One of them couldn't have been older than 19, his face pale as paper, his eyes closed. Another was conscious but clearly in shock, staring at nothing, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. Davis worked with focused intensity, inserting a large bore needle between the ribs of the soldier with the collapsed lung. There was a hissing sound as trapped air escaped from the chest cavity, and the soldier's breathing immediately became less labored. It was a temporary fix, but it might buy enough time to get him to a surgeon. "Good work, Davis. You just saved that man's life," Marcus said, his voice filled with respect for the young medic who was performing surgery in conditions that would have been impossible for most trained physicians. "Not yet, I haven't. Not until we get him on an operating table," Davis replied, but there was a hint of hope in his voice now. "How much longer?" Sarah checked their position. 7 minutes to the FOB. "I've already radioed ahead, they're scrambling their trauma team and clearing the landing pad. The second we touch down, we'll have surgeons waiting." Those 7 minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah kept expecting something to fail, an engine to quit, a transmission to seize, a rotor blade to delaminate from stress. The Apache was shaking badly now, vibrations running through the entire airframe that shouldn't have been there. Something was wrong, but they were so close to the base that she couldn't justify putting down short of their destination. Apache 79er, forward operating base Tillman. "We have you on radar, direct approach approved. Trauma team is standing by, and you better believe the base commander wants to see you in his office the second you land," the tower controller transmitted, his voice a mixture of concern and what might have been admiration. Roger that, Tillman. We'll make it a priority. Apache 79er is on final approach, Sarah responded, beginning her descent toward the brightly lit landing pad where she could see figures rushing around, preparing to receive casualties. The landing was rough. The Apache simply didn't have the fine control necessary for a gentle touchdown with its current weight and damage, but Sarah managed to get them on the ground without further injury to the wounded. The moment the skids touched concrete, the trauma team swarmed the helicopter. Doctors and medics were pulling wounded Rangers from the crew compartment, from the stub wings, even from the soldier who'd been tied to the landing gear. Sarah began the shutdown procedure, her hands moving through the familiar checklist automatically while her mind was still processing everything that had happened. They'd done it. Against all odds, against regulations, against orders, they'd saved 5 men who would have died in that valley. But as she climbed out of the Apache on shaky legs, she got her first good look at the damage the helicopter had sustained. There were bullet holes everywhere, in the fuselage, in the rotor blades, in the tail section. One of the engine cowlings was scorched black from a round that had penetrated dangerously close to a fuel line. They'd been seconds away from catastrophic failure multiple times during that flight, and they hadn't even known it. Marcus joined her, looking equally shaken as he surveyed the damage. Sarah, we should be dead. This helicopter should have fallen out of the sky halfway back. But it didn't. And those Rangers are alive because we were there, Sarah replied, watching as the last of the wounded was loaded onto a stretcher and rushed toward the base hospital. Captain Chen. Captain Chen. Specialist Davis was running toward them, his uniform still covered in blood. He came to a stop in front of Sarah, breathing hard. I just wanted to say, you saved their lives. All 5 of them are still alive because you got us back here fast enough. Whatever happens to you after this, know that 5 families are going to see their sons again because of what you did tonight. Before Sarah could respond, a stern voice cut through the night air. Captain Chen. Lieutenant Rivera. I want both of you in my office. Now. Colonel Marcus Brennan, the base commander, was striding across the tarmac, his face unreadable in the harsh light from the landing pad. This was it. The consequences she'd known were coming. Sarah squared her shoulders and looked at Marcus, who nodded back at her. They'd faced this together, just like they'd faced everything else that night. Colonel Brennan's office was austere and functional, decorated only with unit commendations, a map of the operational theater, and a photo of the colonel with his soldiers. Sarah and Marcus stood at attention in front of his desk, still wearing their flight suits, still reeking of cordite, hydraulic fluid, and blood. Neither had been given time to clean up or debrief properly. The colonel had wanted them immediately, and when a full-bird colonel wanted you immediately, you didn't stop to shower. Brennan sat behind his desk, fingers steepled in front of his face, regarding them with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Disappointment? She'd expected him to start shouting the moment they walked through the door, but instead, he'd simply gestured for them to stand at attention and then studied them in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke. Captain Chen, Lieutenant Rivera. Do you have any idea at all, of the absolute shitstorm you've created tonight? Yes, sir, Sarah responded, keeping her voice level and professional. We disobeyed direct orders from Wildcat Control, deviated from our assigned patrol route, engaged enemy forces without authorization, and performed an unauthorized medical evacuation using an aircraft not designed or approved for such operations. Sir, I take full responsibility for the decision. Lieutenant Rivera was following my orders. The hell I was, Marcus interjected, earning a sharp look from Sarah. Sir, with respect, I made the conscious choice to follow Captain Chen into that valley. I knew we were disobeying orders. I'm equally responsible. Brennan's expression didn't change. Equally responsible. I see. So both of you decided that you knew better than your commanding officer, better than the Tactical Operations Center that has oversight of the entire theater, better than the chain of command that exists for very good reasons. Is that correct? Sir, with respect, 420 Rangers were dying in that valley. The fast movers from Bagram were 45 minutes out. Those men didn't have 45 minutes, Sarah said, meeting the colonel's gaze steadily. I made a tactical decision that air support immediately available was worth more than air support arriving in time to find nothing but corpses. A tactical decision, Brennan repeated, his voice flat. Captain, you're a helicopter pilot, not a theater commander. You don't have the intelligence picture. You don't know what other operations might have been compromised by your unauthorized deviation. You don't know if there were other assets being repositioned that your rogue flight interfered with. You made a decision based on incomplete information and your own emotional response to a distress call. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain calm. The colonel was right, in a way. She hadn't known the full picture. She'd reacted on instinct and training, making the choice that felt right in the moment. But was feeling right the same as being right? Sir, if I may, Marcus spoke up. We saved 5 lives tonight. 5 Rangers who are currently in surgery, who would be dead if we hadn't responded. Doesn't that count for something? Brennan's face finally showed emotion, a flash of anger that made both pilots tense. 5 lives, Lieutenant. Let me tell you about the lives you endangered. When you broke formation and went radio silent, Wildcat Control had to assume you'd been shot down. They diverted search and rescue assets that were earmarked for other missions, to try to find you. Those SAR birds flew into contested airspace with no support because they thought you were down and needed rescue. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She hadn't thought about that. Of course they would have sent SAR when she stopped responding to orders. She'd put even more people at risk without realizing it. The colonel wasn't finished. Furthermore, when you landed in the middle of an active firefight to perform an unauthorized casevac, you presented the enemy with a stationary, high-value target. If they'd managed to shoot you down or capture you, do you have any idea what kind of propaganda victory that would have been for the Taliban? Not to mention the loss of a $40 million aircraft and 2 highly trained pilots. But they didn't shoot us down, sir, Sarah said quietly. We made it out. By sheer luck. I've seen the damage assessment on your aircraft, Captain. You took 67 hits from small arms fire and at least 3 from heavy machine guns. 1 round passed within inches of a fuel line. Another damaged your hydraulic system. Your crew chief estimates you were maybe 10 minutes from total hydraulic failure when you landed. You didn't make it out through skill, Captain. You made it out because you got lucky, and luck is not a valid tactical consideration. The office fell silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the weight of the colonel's words settling on her shoulders. He was right. They'd gambled with their lives, with the lives of the wounded they'd carried, with expensive military hardware, all on a bet that they could pull off something that should have been impossible. Colonel Brennan stood up, walking around his desk to stand directly in front of them. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more intense. Captain Chen, why did you join the army? Why did you fight so hard to become an Apache pilot when you knew you'd face discrimination, skepticism, and resistance every step of the way? The question caught Sarah off guard. Sir, I joined to serve. To protect those who can't protect themselves. To make a difference. To make a difference, Brennan repeated. And did you think you could make more of a difference by being a dead hero, or by living to fly another mission? Because that's the choice you made tonight, whether you realize it or not. You bet everything on one roll of the dice. Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back. She would not cry in front of a superior officer, no matter how much his words cut into her. Sir, I made the choice I thought was right. If I had it to do over, knowing what I know now, I'd make the same choice. Those Rangers needed help that wasn't going to arrive in time. Maybe we got lucky. Maybe we should have died. But we didn't, and those 5 soldiers are alive because of it. For a long moment, Brennan just looked at her, his expression inscrutable. Then, slowly, something changed in his face. The anger faded, replaced by something that might have been respect, or perhaps resignation. You're right, he said finally, and both Sarah and Marcus looked at him in shock. You're absolutely right. Those Rangers are alive because you broke the rules. And that puts me in an impossible position, Captain, because I should court-martial you. I should end your career right here, right now, as an example to every other pilot who might think they can just ignore orders and go off to play hero. Colonel Brennan walked back to his desk and pulled out a folder, opening it to reveal what looked like after-action reports and intelligence summaries. He studied them for a moment before continuing. Let me tell you what happened in the Karengal Valley after you left, since you were too busy playing flying ambulance to monitor the tactical net. Sarah and Marcus remained at attention, but she could see Marcus tense beside her, preparing for whatever blow was coming. The fast movers from Bagram arrived 37 minutes after your unauthorized intervention. By that time, thanks in large part to the chaos you created with your attack runs, the Rangers had managed to stabilize their perimeter. The F-16s made multiple gun runs and dropped precision-guided munitions on enemy positions, breaking the back of the Taliban assault. Chinooks came in under cover of the air support and extracted all 420 Rangers, well, 415, since you already took 5 of them. The colonel looked up from the folder, his eyes hard. Final count, 63 Rangers killed in action, 147 wounded. The Taliban lost an estimated 400 fighters. It was a bloodbath, Captain. A complete disaster that never should have happened because our intelligence was garbage and somebody decided to send a large force into terrain we knew the enemy controlled. Sarah felt the weight of those numbers. 63 dead. Over 140 wounded. And they'd saved 5. It seemed like such a small number compared to the total carnage. But here's the thing, Brennan continued, his voice taking on a different tone. Major Harrison, the Ranger commander you spoke with, filed a report. He stated that your attack runs in those first few minutes broke up a coordinated assault that would have overrun their position. He credits you with buying them the time they needed to reorganize their defense. He also stated that your willingness to land and extract casualties gave his men hope when they had none, helped them find the will to keep fighting when it would have been easier to just give up and die. The colonel pulled out another piece of paper. I've also received communications from the families of the 5 Rangers you extracted. All 5 are going to survive, by the way. All 5 are going to go home to their families, going to have lives and careers and children and grandchildren, all because you broke the rules. Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest, a tight knot of tension she'd been carrying since they landed beginning to loosen. They'd survived. The men they'd saved were going to live. I've also received communications from 3rd Army Headquarters, from CENTCOM, and from the Pentagon, Brennan continued, and his voice went cold again. They want your head on a platter, Captain. They want to make an example of you, to show every other pilot that you don't get to just ignore orders because you feel like it. They're talking about court-martial, about dishonorable discharge, about stripping you of your flight status and possibly bringing criminal charges. The moment of relief shattered. Sarah had known consequences were coming, but hearing them laid out so starkly made them real in a way they hadn't been before. Her career was over. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed, gone because of one decision made in the heat of the moment. However, Brennan said, and that one word made both pilots look up sharply, I've also received communications from every single Ranger unit in theater. They're calling you a hero. They're demanding that you receive commendations, not condemnation. Several chaplains have informed me that the story of what you did is spreading through the ranks like wildfire, boosting morale at a time when we desperately need it. The colonel closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. I've also received a personal communication from Major General Patricia Hawkins, the commanding general of this entire operational theater. She happens to be one of the first women to command a combat division, and she had some very pointed things to say about the treatment of female pilots who show initiative and courage. Sarah's mind was reeling. General Hawkins was a legend, a soldier who'd broken through countless barriers to reach the highest levels of command. If she was intervening on Sarah's behalf. General Hawkins pointed out that if you had been a male pilot, this conversation would probably be going very differently. She suggested that perhaps some of the officers calling for your court-martial are more concerned with the fact that you're a woman who made them look bad than with the actual violation of orders. She's made it very clear that any proceedings against you will be watched very, very carefully for any hint of gender bias. Brennan stood up again, and this time when he looked at Sarah and Marcus, there was something almost like sympathy in his eyes. So here's what's going to happen. You're both grounded, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. You will submit detailed after-action reports documenting every decision you made and why you made it. You will cooperate fully with the investigators. And then we're going to see whether your careers survive this. Yes, sir, Sarah and Marcus responded in unison. However, Brennan continued, I want you to know something. Off the record, completely between us, what you did tonight was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've seen in 30 years of service. Possibly both. You saved lives at tremendous risk to yourselves and to your aircraft. You showed courage, skill, and a commitment to your fellow soldiers that frankly put some of our senior officers to shame. The colonel extended his hand, first to Sarah, then to Marcus. I can't officially condone what you did. But personally, I'm damn proud to have pilots like you in my command. Now get out of here and get some rest. You're going to need it for what's coming. Sarah and Marcus left the colonel's office in a daze, neither speaking as they walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the pilot quarters. The base was beginning to come alive as soldiers started their daily routines, unaware of the drama that had played out overnight. For them, it was just another day in the war. For Sarah, it felt like her entire life was hanging by a thread. That could have gone worse, Marcus finally said as they reached the quarters they shared with other aviators. Could it? Sarah asked, her voice hollow. We're grounded, under investigation, facing possible court-martial. My career is probably over, Marcus. Everything I've worked for since I was 18 years old, gone. But 5 Rangers are alive, Marcus replied quietly. 5 men who would be dead. You heard the colonel, they're all going to make it. Doesn't that mean something? Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her co-pilot. Of course it means something. It means everything. But I also have to wonder if I just threw away my career because I couldn't follow orders. What if the colonel's right? What if I just got lucky, and next time someone tries what I did, they die? Then they die trying to save lives instead of living by following orders that would have let soldiers die. Sarah, you can second-guess yourself all you want, but I was there. I saw those Rangers. They were being slaughtered, and we were the only help available. You made the right call. Marcus put a hand on her shoulder. Now come on, we need to write those reports while everything is still fresh. The next several hours were a blur of paperwork, documentation, and reliving every moment of the mission. Sarah filled out form after form, describing in clinical detail every decision, every action, every shot fired. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work, especially as the adrenaline of combat wore off and the full weight of what she'd done, and what she was facing, settled onto her shoulders. She was nearly finished with her report when there was a knock on her door. Opening it, she found Specialist Davis, the medic who'd kept the wounded alive during their desperate flight. He was cleaned up now, his uniform fresh, but there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept any more than she had. Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to give you an update on the Rangers we brought back, Davis said, seeming nervous about interrupting her. Please, come in. I've been wondering about them, Sarah said, stepping aside to let him enter her small quarters. Davis entered, looking around at the Spartan room with its narrow bunk, small desk, and personal effects that spoke to a life lived primarily in service. All 5 are out of surgery and stable. The kid with the collapsed lung, Private First Class Tommy Morrison, he's going to make a full recovery. The surgeon said if we'd been another 10 minutes, he wouldn't have made it. As it was close. Sarah felt tears threatening again and this time didn't fight them quite as hard. What about the others? Sergeant William Hayes had a severed femoral artery and had lost about half his blood volume. He's going to need months of physical therapy, but he'll walk again. Corporal David Chen, no relation to you, ma'am, had severe shrapnel wounds to his abdomen. They had to remove part of his intestine, but he's stable. Private Marcus Johnson had a sucking chest wound and multiple broken ribs, but he's already asking when he can return to duty. Davis smiled at that last part. And Specialist Robert Taylor had a head wound that looked worse than it was. He's got a concussion and needed stitches, but he's going to be fine. 5 names. 5 men with families waiting for them back home, Sarah said softly. Thank you for telling me, Specialist. It helps. Davis hesitated, then spoke again. Ma'am, I heard you're under investigation. I heard they might court-martial you for what you did. I just want you to know that's bullshit, excuse my language, ma'am. Those Rangers are alive because you had the guts to do what needed to be done. I've written a statement for the investigation, and I've told them exactly that. You didn't have to do that, Sarah said, surprised and touched by the young medic's loyalty. Yes, ma'am, I did. Because if the Army punishes you for saving lives, then what the hell are we even doing here? What's the point of any of this if we let good soldiers die just to follow some rule written by people who've never been in combat? Davis stood at attention and saluted. You're a hero, Captain Chen. Don't let anyone tell you different. After Davis left, Sarah sat down on her bunk and finally let herself cry. Not from sadness or fear for her career, but from sheer emotional exhaustion. She'd been holding herself together through pure force of will, and now that the immediate crisis was over, everything came flooding out. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually, there was another knock. This time it was Marcus, looking as exhausted as she felt. They want us in the conference room in 1 hour. The investigation team has arrived from Bagram, and they want to conduct preliminary interviews, he said, then saw her face. Hey, you okay? No, Sarah admitted. I'm not okay. I'm scared, Marcus. I'm scared that I threw away my career, scared that I set a bad example, scared that someone else is going to try what we did and die. I'm scared that maybe everyone calling for my head is right. Marcus sat down beside her on the bunk. You know what I'm scared of? I'm scared of becoming the kind of pilot who hears a distress call and does nothing because following orders is more important than saving lives. I'm scared of looking myself in the mirror in 20 years and wondering if I could have saved those Rangers but didn't because I was worried about my career. He looked at her seriously. Sarah, whatever happens, we did the right thing. I'm proud to have been your co-pilot tonight. And whatever the investigation finds, I'll stand by you. We're in this together. The conference room at Forward Operating Base Tillman had been converted into an impromptu investigation chamber. 3 officers sat behind a long table, a lieutenant colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a major from the Inspector General's office, and a chief warrant officer who was apparently an expert in Apache operations and procedures. They represented the full weight of military justice and bureaucracy, and they did not look friendly. Sarah and Marcus sat across from them, with Colonel Brennan sitting off to the side as an observer. The atmosphere was formal, cold, and deeply uncomfortable. Sarah had been through plenty of debriefings in her career, but this felt different. This felt like being on trial. The JAG officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Simmons, led the questioning. She was in her mid-40s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see through any attempt at evasion or deception. Captain Chen, let's begin with the moment you received the distress call from Ranger 27 Actual. You were on a routine patrol at the time, is that correct? Simmons asked, her voice professionally neutral. Yes, ma'am. We were patrolling Grid Sector Echo 7, maintaining air superiority and conducting reconnaissance, Sarah responded, keeping her voice steady and professional. And you received a direct order from Wildcat Control not to deviate from your patrol route, not to respond to the distress call. Is that also correct? Yes, ma'am. Yet you chose to disobey that direct order and proceed to the coordinates where the Rangers were under attack. Can you explain your reasoning? Simmons's pen was poised over her notepad, ready to record every word. Sarah took a breath, organizing her thoughts. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Ma'am, the distress call indicated that 420 Rangers were pinned down and taking heavy casualties. Wildcat Control informed us that fast-moving aircraft from Bagram were being scrambled, with an estimated time of arrival of 45 minutes. Based on my combat experience and the intensity of fire I could hear over the radio, I assessed that the Rangers would sustain catastrophic casualties before air support could arrive. So you made a tactical assessment that contradicted the assessment of your commanding officers? Simmons pressed. I made a tactical assessment based on information immediately available to me in the field. The Rangers were in contact with the enemy at that moment. The situation was evolving rapidly. Every second of delay meant more casualties. The major from the IG's office leaned forward. Captain, are you aware that your unauthorized deviation caused search and rescue assets to be diverted, potentially putting other missions at risk? I was not aware of that at the time, sir. I maintained radio silence because I was operating in a hostile environment and needed to focus on the mission. However, I take full responsibility for any consequences that resulted from my actions. The chief warrant officer, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. His name tape read Harrison, no relation to the Ranger Major, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits. Captain, I've reviewed the damage assessment of your aircraft. You took 67 hits from small arms fire, damage to hydraulics, damage to engine cowlings, and flew the aircraft approximately 700 pounds over maximum takeoff weight. How did you manage to get that bird back to base? Sarah met his eyes. A combination of proper flight procedures, constant monitoring of all systems, and favorable conditions, Chief. We were lucky. Lucky, Harrison repeated, and there might have been the ghost of a smile on his weathered face. Ma'am, I've been flying Apaches for 23 years. What you did wasn't lucky. It was extraordinary flying under impossible conditions. But that doesn't change the fact that you violated multiple regulations regarding aircraft limitations. No, Chief, it doesn't, Sarah agreed. There was no point in denying the obvious. Lieutenant Colonel Simmons referred to her notes. Let's talk about your decision to land in an active combat zone to extract casualties. An Apache is not authorized or configured for medical evacuation. You had no orders to conduct a casevac. Yet you chose to put your aircraft, your crew, and the wounded you were attempting to rescue at tremendous risk. Explain your thinking. This was the hardest question, because Sarah knew her answer was going to sound emotional rather than tactical. Ma'am, I had expended most of our ordnance providing close air support to the Rangers. Our presence had temporarily disrupted the enemy assault, giving the Rangers a brief window. I was informed that they had critically wounded soldiers who would not survive until proper casevac assets could arrive. I assessed that the Apache, while not designed for personnel transport, could physically accommodate a small number of casualties. I made the decision to use our aircraft to save lives while we had the opportunity. You made the decision, Simmons emphasized. You, a captain, overruled standing procedures, regulations, and common sense to attempt something that had never been done before in combat. Do you understand how dangerous that precedent is? What happens when another pilot decides they know better than their chain of command and attempts something similar but fails? What happens when that pilot and their crew die, along with the people they were trying to save? Sarah felt the weight of that question. It was the same question she'd been asking herself since they landed. Ma'am, I understand the concern. But I also understand that regulations exist to guide decision-making, not to replace it. Every situation is unique. Every combat scenario requires judgment calls. I made the call I thought was right based on the information available to me. And if you had been wrong? If your aircraft had been shot down during that landing? If the wounded had died because you crashed? Simmons pushed. Then I would have been wrong, ma'am. But I wasn't. 5 men are alive today because of the decision I made. The room fell silent. Simmons exchanged looks with her fellow investigators, some kind of unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, she spoke again. Captain Chen, Lieutenant Rivera, you're dismissed for now. We'll continue this investigation over the next several days. You're both confined to base and relieved of flight status until further notice. We'll notify you when we need to speak with you again. Sarah and Marcus stood, saluted, and left the conference room. As they walked out, Sarah caught Colonel Brennan's eye. He gave her the slightest nod, whether of approval, sympathy, or something else, she couldn't tell. Outside the conference room, Marcus let out a long breath. Well, that was fun. I feel like I just went 12 rounds with a heavyweight boxer. It's only going to get harder, Sarah replied. They're building their case. Every question is designed to show that we were reckless, that we endangered lives instead of saving them. But we did save them, Marcus insisted. 5 Rangers who would be dead. That has to count for something. We'll find out, Sarah said grimly. We'll find out if saving lives matters more than following orders. The investigation dragged on for 6 days. 6 days of interrogations, technical reviews, witness statements, and endless paperwork. Sarah and Marcus were interviewed separately and together, their stories picked apart and examined from every angle. Investigators spoke with Colonel Brennan, with Wildcat Control, with the crew chiefs who'd assessed the damage to their Apache, with the surgeons who'd operated on the wounded Rangers, and with Specialist Davis who'd kept those men alive during the flight. Most significantly, they interviewed Major Douglas Harrison, the Ranger commander who'd been on the ground in the Karengal Valley that night. Sarah never got to hear his testimony directly, but word filtered through the base that he'd been unequivocal in his support. He'd told the investigators that Captain Chen's intervention had saved not just the 5 men she'd evacuated, but potentially dozens more by breaking up the coordinated Taliban assault at its critical moment. During those 6 days, Sarah existed in a strange limbo. She wasn't confined to quarters, but she wasn't allowed to fly. She couldn't leave the base, couldn't speak to media who were somehow already calling about the story, couldn't do much of anything except wait and worry. Other pilots stopped her in the hallways to express support, but she could also feel the judgment from some of the senior officers. She'd broken the most fundamental rule of military service, she'd disobeyed orders, and no matter how noble her intentions, that couldn't be easily forgiven. On the morning of the 7th day, she and Marcus were summoned back to the conference room. This time, General Patricia Hawkins herself was present, having flown in from theater headquarters. The general was a compact woman in her mid-50s, her uniform immaculate, her bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of exemplary service. She'd commanded units in Iraq and Afghanistan, had been wounded twice, and had broken through barriers that many thought would never fall. Lieutenant Colonel Simmons stood as Sarah and Marcus entered. Captain Chen, Lieutenant Rivera, the investigation has been completed. General Hawkins will deliver the findings. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was it. Her career, her future, her entire life balanced on what the general was about to say. General Hawkins stood, but rather than speaking immediately, she walked around the table to stand directly in front of Sarah and Marcus. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, thoughtful. Captain Chen, I'm going to be frank with you. This investigation has been one of the most complex and controversial cases I've dealt with in my career. On one hand, you deliberately disobeyed direct orders from your command authority. You deviated from your assigned mission without authorization. You operated your aircraft outside of approved parameters and procedures. You put yourself, your co-pilot, and the wounded you were transporting at considerable risk. From a purely regulatory standpoint, your actions violated numerous articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Sarah felt her stomach sink. This was it. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. The end of everything she'd worked for. However, General Hawkins continued, we must also consider the results of your actions and the context in which they occurred. 5 critically wounded soldiers are alive today because of your intervention. Major Harrison has testified that your attack runs provided crucial support at a moment when his Rangers were on the verge of being overrun. Your actions, while technically insubordinate, demonstrated extraordinary courage, flying skill, and a commitment to the welfare of fellow soldiers that exemplifies the very best of Army values. The general paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. I've spoken with the Rangers you saved. I've spoken with their families. I've spoken with Private Morrison's mother, who wanted me to tell you that her son, her only child, is going to walk her down the aisle at her wedding next month because you broke the rules to save his life. I've spoken with Sergeant Hayes's 3 daughters, who wanted me to tell you that their daddy is coming home because you had the courage to act when others would have followed orders and done nothing. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. She could see Marcus struggling with his own emotions beside her. The question before us, General Hawkins continued, is whether the military needs soldiers who blindly follow orders, or whether we need soldiers who can make difficult decisions under pressure, even when those decisions violate regulations. And I believe, the investigation team believes, that we need both. We need discipline and order, but we also need judgment and courage. The general returned to the table and picked up a document. Therefore, the findings of this investigation are as follows. Captain Sarah Chen and Lieutenant Marcus Rivera are found to have violated orders and multiple regulations regarding aircraft operations and mission parameters. However, given the extraordinary circumstances, the life-or-death nature of the situation, and the positive outcome of their actions, we are recommending non-judicial punishment under Article 15 rather than court-martial. Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. Article 15 meant she'd face administrative punishment, probably a letter of reprimand, possibly loss of pay, but not criminal charges. Her career would take a hit, but it wouldn't be destroyed. Additionally, General Hawkins continued, I am recommending that both Captain Chen and Lieutenant Rivera receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under combat conditions. Your actions, while technically in violation of orders, demonstrated valor and flying skill of the highest order. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. A reprimand and a medal? It was almost contradictory, but in a strange way, it made perfect sense. The army was acknowledging both that she'd broken the rules and that breaking those rules had been the right thing to do. However, and the general's voice became stern, there are consequences beyond the Article 15. Captain Chen, you are hereby grounded from combat flight operations for a period of 90 days. You will undergo additional training in command decision-making and rules of engagement. You will also be reassigned from your current unit to a training command, where you will serve as an instructor pilot teaching the next generation of Apache pilots. Sarah's relief mixed with disappointment. She'd be flying again, but not in combat. Not where she felt she could make the most difference. But she was alive, her career was intact, and she'd be able to keep doing what she loved, even if it wasn't in the way she'd expected. Lieutenant Rivera, you are grounded for 30 days and will undergo similar additional training, after which you will return to flight status with your current unit, General Hawkins continued. The difference in punishment reflects the investigation's finding that Captain Chen, as the pilot in command, bore primary responsibility for the decisions made that night. Marcus started to protest, "Ma'am, I was equally," but the general cut him off with a sharp look. "Lieutenant, the findings stand. Accept them with grace." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, subsiding. General Hawkins walked back to stand in front of Sarah. "Captain Chen, I want you to understand something. What you did that night was both wrong and right. It was a violation of military discipline and an act of extraordinary heroism. It saved lives and could have cost lives. You're being punished because you broke the rules, and you're being decorated because you broke them for the right reasons. That's the complexity of command, the burden of leadership. Can you accept that?" Sarah straightened to attention, wiping the tears from her face. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." "Good. Because I need you to understand something else. The story of what you did is spreading through every unit in theater. You've become a symbol, to some, a symbol of courage and dedication, to others, a symbol of indiscipline and recklessness. How you conduct yourself from this point forward will determine which of those narratives becomes your legacy. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then let me tell you what I want your legacy to be," General Hawkins said, her voice softening slightly. "I want you to be the pilot who saved lives when it mattered most. I want you to be the instructor who teaches the next generation not just how to fly, but how to think, how to make hard decisions under pressure, how to balance following orders with doing what's right. I want you to be living proof that women can excel in combat aviation and handle the moral complexity that comes with it. Can you do that, Captain?" Sarah felt something shift inside her, a weight she'd been carrying since that night beginning to transform into something else, purpose. Yes, ma'am. I can do that. Outstanding. General Hawkins stepped back and saluted. Captain Chen, Lieutenant Rivera, you're dismissed. Welcome back to the Army. Fort Rucker, Alabama, was a long way from the mountains of Afghanistan, both geographically and psychologically. Sarah had spent the last 4 months here as an instructor pilot, teaching young aviators how to fly the Apache, how to think tactically, how to make decisions under pressure. It wasn't combat flying, but she'd come to realize it was perhaps more important. Every student she trained might one day face a situation like the one she'd faced in the Karengal Valley, and she could give them the tools to handle it. She was in the middle of a classroom instruction session, teaching a group of 20 students about close air support procedures, when there was a knock on the door. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy, stuck his head in. Captain Chen, sorry to interrupt. You have visitors. Sarah excused herself and stepped into the hallway, wondering who could be visiting her during the duty day. What she saw made her freeze. 5 men in Army uniforms stood in the hallway. She recognized them immediately, even though the last time she'd seen them, they'd been covered in blood and barely conscious. Private First Class Tommy Morrison, Sergeant William Hayes, Corporal David Chen, Private Marcus Johnson, and Specialist Robert Taylor, the 5 Rangers she'd pulled out of the Karengal Valley. Ma'am, Sergeant Hayes spoke first, stepping forward. We wanted to come thank you in person. All 5 of us owe our lives to you. Sarah found herself speechless, overwhelmed by seeing them here, alive, healthy, standing on their own feet. Morrison looked barely old enough to shave, his face eager and young. Hayes walked with a slight limp but otherwise seemed fully recovered. The others all bore the marks of their ordeal, scars, subtle changes in posture, but they were alive. I don't know what to say, Sarah managed finally. I'm just glad you all made it. How are you doing? Better than we have any right to be, thanks to you, Corporal Chen said with a smile. Morrison here got married last month. Hayes's daughters won't stop talking about the helicopter lady who saved their dad. Johnson's back with his unit, he deployed again last month, the crazy bastard. Taylor's going to college on the GI Bill. And I'm training to be a Ranger instructor. We heard you got in trouble for saving us, Morrison added, his young face troubled. That doesn't seem right, ma'am. Sarah smiled. It's complicated. The Army has rules for good reasons, and I broke them. But I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Seeing you all here, alive and well, this is worth any amount of punishment. Well, we wanted to give you something, Hayes said, pulling out a framed photograph. This is all of us with our families we wouldn't have if not for you. We wanted you to have it, to remember that what you did mattered. That we mattered. Sarah took the photograph, her vision blurring with tears as she looked at it. 5 Rangers surrounded by wives, children, parents, siblings, dozens of people whose lives had been forever changed by one night in a valley halfway around the world. Thank you, she whispered. This means more than you know. They talked for a while longer, sharing stories, updates, remembering that night from different perspectives. Eventually, they had to leave. They'd taken time from their own duties to make this visit, but before they went, Sergeant Hayes had one final thing to say. Ma'am, there's something you should know. Major Harrison, our commander that night, he's been promoted to lieutenant colonel. He's working at the Pentagon now, helping to rewrite doctrine for air-ground coordination. He told me to tell you that your actions that night are being studied as a case example of adaptive decision-making under pressure. Not as what not to do, but as an example of how courage and judgment sometimes matter more than following the book. After they left, Sarah stood in the hallway for a long time, holding the photograph, thinking about everything that had happened. She'd faced investigation, punishment, and reassignment. She'd been held up as both a hero and a cautionary tale. Her career had been forever altered by one night's decisions. But 5 men were alive. 5 families were intact. And maybe, just maybe, she'd helped change the conversation about what it meant to be a leader, about when rules should be followed and when they should be broken, about what courage really looked like. She returned to her classroom, where her students were waiting. Looking at their young, eager faces, the next generation of Apache pilots, she realized that this was where she needed to be. Not in combat, but here, teaching them not just how to fly, but how to think, how to choose, how to live with the consequences of their decisions. "All right, let's continue," she said, setting the photograph carefully on her desk where she could see it. "We were discussing close air support procedures, but I want to shift gears for a moment. I want to talk to you about something more important than any procedure or regulation. I want to talk to you about judgment, about leadership, and about the moment when you have to decide whether following orders or saving lives matters more." The students leaned forward, sensing that this was going to be different from the standard curriculum. Sarah took a breath and began to tell them a story, not as a warning, not as a blueprint, but as a truth. 6 months ago, I heard a distress call from 420 Rangers who were about to die. And I had to make a choice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.